In wanting to replace the hideous and wasteful ceiling lights in our living room, we trawled through the numerous examples for sale on the internet and discovered that there was nothing quite as we wanted them, or they were ridiculously expensive. So, why not make them? Why not indeed? And this is what I came up with. Stylish, even funky, cheap and quite fun to get right. Deciding that I needed something quite stiff to support the bulb sockets, I started with some clean, empty food tins. The design has 4 leaf shapes, so 4 tins. Firstly, cutting off the ends, then cutting the length of the cylinder part and removing the seams. To make the parts that hold the bulb sockets, 4 lids were marked using the threaded shade grip as a guide. This circle was cut out and adjusted with pliers to get a good tight fit on the male thread of the socket. The perimeter of the lid was cut into so that the flanges created could be bent at 90 degrees to marry up with the larger leaf section. The larger pieces of tin cylinders were flattened out and cut about 2/3 lengthways down the middle, with 3 diagonals along each long edge so that the concave leaf shape could be created. Sellotape is useful to hold the edges together at this stage, and curving the sides was easy, but then so was cutting oneself on the very sharp edges. Gorilla Glue was used to glue the socket support into the end of the leaf shape and held with sellotape while the glue set. Thin card, about 200 grams per square metre, rather like postcard thickness, was used to make the outer leaf shape. An A5 piece was drawn up and cut as shown. Then the longer strips were interleaved from the middle, left then right, etc. to make the curved pointed end, and held together by being stapled. The shorter strips were folded round the end nearest the bulb socket. Again, sellotape helped to hold everything together for the next stage. The overlaps of the long strips at the point were trimmed to accentuate the point. The next stage was to cover the thin card with an oil-based paint so that during the application of the papier-mâché layer, it still retained its shape rather than collapse by getting damp. The papier-mâché was laid on in strips, glued with diluted PVA. Perhaps about 3 layers covering the outside and over the edges is sufficient. Another layer of paint, emulsion this time, helped to seal it all in and give a good key for the edges. The easiest way to fix the cable to make a strong ridge around the edges was to hold the pieces in place first with clothes pegs, and then brush PVA between the cable and the painted papier-mâché between the pegs. When this glue stitching was dry, the pegs were removed and further gluing with a brush completed the task. To give the leaf shapes a more organic look, veins of string were glued on the underside, then smoothed with more papier-mâché. More paint helped to protect the papier-mâché from the damp layer of filler that would produce the finishing texture. PVA was mixed in with the filler. The result was more adhesive and stronger, good for filing, rasping and sanding to get the desired finish before the final coats of paint. In reality, the filler needed to be applied more than once, with sanding in between, so that the surface was as smooth as required. A layer of kitchen foil fixed with PVA on the inside of the leaf shapes makes a good reflector to utilise all the light emitted by the bulb. Finally, layers of paint were applied until a suitable finish was achieved. The hub, to hold the stems of the leaf shapes, distribute the electricity to each bulb via cables, and enable an attachment to the ceiling, was made of wood. A horseshoe-shaped hole gave space for a connector and a central tongue to attach the finishing cap. 4 holes were drilled right through the width of the hub and of a diameter that gave a tight fitting for the stems. On the upper side of the hub, grooves from the centre to the holes enabled the cables to be fixed below the upper surface. The finishing cap, complete with a neat little cap for the screw, was fashioned from 2 circles of wood stuck together and centrally drilled. The stems were made of 30 centimetres of soft copper tubing, usually used for gas fittings. With care, the tubing can be curved into the required shape. Then, with careful drilling and filing of the bulb socket hole and filing down the end of the stem, a tight fit was achieved. This joint supports the leaf shape and its bulb, so a tight fit and some epoxy glue made them as strong as possible. When the stems were glued, using 2-pack epoxy glue, into the holes of the hub, it looked neat if another short section of tubing was glued at the base as well. In this design, the stems were glued together where they touched to give greater strength. Drilled holes through the hub inside the perimeter of the finishing cap to attach the light fitting to the ceiling needed to marry up with the joist where the wiring comes out of the ceiling. Then the cables can be introduced along the stems, joined to the bulb sockets and brought together to a connector in the centre of the hub. Once the leaf shapes were attached, the wiring connector joined to the wires from the ceiling, with the power turned off of course, the hub could be screwed into the joist and the finishing cap screwed on to hide the screws and wiring. These lights have bayonet fitting dimmable LED bulbs, but clearly different styles of bulb would be possible, provided the sockets are compatible.